In a long-forgotten house at the edge of a deserted town, strange things often happened. The house wasn't just old, it was ancient. Its walls seemed to hold the weight of centuries of dark memories. Everything around it was covered in dust and neglect, as if time itself had forgotten this place. Rumors whispered that once, many years ago, peculiar people had lived here, but now, the house stood abandoned, its surroundings swallowed by an impenetrable forest. Mikhail, a young journalist, was not one to believe in the supernatural. His job was to write articles about the everyday, the logical, the things that could be explained. So when he heard about this eerie house from an old woman in the town, he saw it as nothing more than a story for a slow news week. It was the perfect subject for a piece that would be forgotten by the next morning. Why not, he thought. I'll go, take a few pictures, write some spooky lines, and move on. The house was easy to find. The air grew colder as Mikhail approached, the dense trees pressing in on either side of the narrow path. The house itself was massive, towering with sagging rooflines and cracked windows. The once grand facade was now a decaying relic, a ghost of its former self. A heavy feeling settled over Mikhail, but he shrugged it off, telling himself it was just the weight of time and abandonment. He entered through the front door, which creaked ominously as it opened, revealing a dark hallway. The smell of mildew and aged wood filled his nostrils. Dust motes danced in the air as his footsteps echoed through the silence. As he moved deeper into the house, he couldn't help but feel as though he were being watched. Just my imagination, Mikhail muttered to himself, reaching for his camera. He snapped a few photos of the worn-out furniture and peeling wallpaper. The floorboards groaned under his weight as he ascended the grand staircase, heading towards the attic. The door to the attic was tucked away in a shadowy corner of the upstairs hallway. It looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. Mikhail's curiosity got the better of him. He reached for the knob, and to his surprise, it turned easily. The door swung open with a heavy groan, revealing the dimly lit attic. Inside, the air was thick, and the dust was so dense it seemed to hang in the air, making each breath feel labored. The only light came from the small, cracked window at the far end of the room. Boxes and old furniture were scattered around, as if abandoned in haste. But it was the far corner of the attic that caught Mikhail's attention. There, in the shadows, stood a tall, dark figure. For a moment, Mikhail thought it was just another piece of forgotten furniture, but as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he realized the figure was moving. It was no piece of furniture. It was a person, or at least, something that looked like one. The figure stood unnaturally still, its head tilted at an odd angle. Its face was hidden in the shadows, but Mikhail could feel its eyes on him, though he couldn't see them. His heart raced. He wanted to turn and run, but something held him in place. A cold shiver ran down his spine, and for the first time, Mikhail felt fear grip him. The figure began to step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. "Who's there?" Mikhail called, his voice trembling despite himself. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it took another slow, deliberate step toward him. Mikhail fumbled for his camera, his hands shaking. He snapped a photo, but the flash illuminated nothing but empty space. The figure was gone. His breath came in ragged gasps as he backed toward the door, but then he heard something, a whisper, a soft murmur that seemed to come from all around him. "Leave, before it's too late." Mikhail froze, his blood running cold. He was no longer alone. The shadows seemed to shift, closing in on him. His body screamed to run, but his legs felt like lead. He glanced over his shoulder, and for a fleeting moment, he saw the figure again, this time, standing directly behind him, its face now visible in the faint light. The face was not human. It was a twisted mockery of a face, with hollow eyes and a mouth stretched wide in a grotesque grin. It was a face that didn't belong in this world. Mikhail's heart pounded in his chest. He reached for the door, but it slammed shut on its own, trapping him inside. The shadows in the attic seemed to grow darker, more oppressive, until Mikhail could barely see his own hand in front of his face. The whispering grew louder, more urgent. "Leave now, or you will be one of us." Suddenly, the attic light flickered and went out, plunging Mikhail into total darkness. He could hear the sound of footsteps approaching, slow, deliberate, unyielding. The figure was getting closer. Without thinking, Mikhail scrambled for the door, banging on it with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. He could feel the air growing colder, the darkness swallowing him whole. The whispering was now a chant, a rhythmic sound that seemed to come from everywhere. He was trapped. In that moment, Mikhail realized the truth. Whatever haunted this house, it wasn't a simple ghost or an old legend. It was something far worse, something that had been waiting for him, just as it had waited for anyone foolish enough to enter. And as the shadow closed in, Mikhail felt his mind unravel, the whispering consuming him, pulling him into the very darkness he feared. The last thing he heard before the darkness took him was the soft, chilling voice of the figure. "You're part of us now." The next morning, the town remained as it always had, quiet and still. But in the attic of the old house, the shadow waited, as patient as ever, for its next visitor. Weeks passed, and the abandoned house remained as it always had, a decaying monument to something forgotten. But the stories of Mikhail's disappearance began to spread. The townspeople whispered among themselves, recalling the strange journalist who had dared to enter the house and never returned. Some claimed he had simply run off, but others knew better. Marina, a local historian and an old friend of Mikhail's, was determined to find out the truth. She had been following his investigation into the house for some time, and when he suddenly stopped responding to her messages, something told her that the house had claimed him, just as it had taken so many before. She wasn't one to believe in superstitions or ghost stories, but there was something about the house that made her uneasy. She had visited it herself once, years ago, during a childhood dare, and she had seen things she could never explain, fleeting shadows, the feeling of being watched, the overwhelming sense of despair that seemed to settle over her the moment she crossed the threshold. But she had to know the truth. She had to find Mikhail. And maybe, just maybe, she could uncover the secrets of the house that had been hidden for so long. Armed with only her courage and a flashlight, Marina set out one afternoon to the house. The town was eerily quiet as she walked down the narrow path leading to the decaying structure, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of dead leaves that had accumulated over the years. The wind howled through the trees, as if warning her to turn back, but she pressed on. When she reached the house, it was even more oppressive than she remembered. The sky was clouded, casting a dull, gray light over the once grand building, now reduced to a shadow of its former self. The front door was ajar, creaking slightly as if beckoning her inside. Marina hesitated for a moment. There was a knot in her stomach, a sense that something was terribly wrong, but she steeled herself. Mikhail was in there. He had to be. And she would find him, no matter what. She stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and dust hung heavy in the air, catching the dim light that filtered through the cracked windows. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the worn-out furniture and peeling wallpaper that seemed frozen in time. Marina moved cautiously through the house, her heart pounding in her chest. Every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet sounded like a warning. As she ascended the grand staircase, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching her. Her breath caught in her throat when she reached the top, her eyes drawn to the attic door. It was exactly as Mikhail had described it, dark, weathered, and seemingly untouched by time. The door was half open, just as it had been the last time she'd been here, but now it felt like an invitation to something darker than she could imagine. She pushed the door open slowly, her hand trembling slightly. The moment it swung wide, she was struck by an overwhelming sense of cold. It was as though the temperature in the attic had dropped several degrees in an instant. The beam from her flashlight flickered, and the shadows seemed to shift unnaturally in the corners of the room. For a moment, everything was silent. The air was thick with anticipation, like the house was holding its breath. And then, she heard it. A whisper. Faint, but unmistakable. "Leave, before it's too late." Marina froze, the blood draining from her face. She couldn't tell where the voice was coming from. It seemed to echo in her mind, surrounding her from every direction. The flashlight trembled in her grip as her eye at first. She thought it was just an old wardrobe or a pile of furniture, but as her flashlight swept over it, she realized the truth. It was the same figure Mikhail had seen. The figure was tall, its outline barely visible in the shadows. The longer she looked at it, the more she could make out the twisted silhouette, the unnatural angle of its limbs, and the chilling way it seemed to move ever so slightly, as though it were waiting for her to make the next move. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaking. The figure did not respond. Instead, it took one slow, deliberate step forward. Marina's heart raced. Her mind screamed at her to run, to leave the house and never look back. But her feet felt rooted to the spot, as though the very ground beneath her had a hold on her. The figure continued to move toward her, its presence growing more suffocating with every passing second. She could feel the cold seeping into her bones, the darkness closing in on her. And then, as if summoned by her fear, the whisper returned, louder this time, more insistent. "You shouldn't have come, you will never leave." Suddenly, the figure lunged forward, and Marina stumbled back, her hand hitting the old wooden beams behind her. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging the room into pitch-black darkness. Her breath caught in her throat, and her pulse raced. She could feel the air growing heavier, colder, as if something was closing in around her. She heard the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming closer. Panic surged through her as she scrambled for the door, her hands frantically searching for the handle. The whispering grew louder, now a chorus of voices, all chanting in a language she didn't understand. The darkness seemed to press against her, suffocating her, pulling her into its depths. With a final burst of strength, Marina wrenched the door open and stumbled back into the hallway. She didn't look back as she raced down the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers followed her, growing louder and more frantic. When she reached the front door, it slammed shut in her face, trapping her inside once more. And then, for a moment, everything went silent. The whispers stopped. The shadows receded. The coldness disappeared. But Marina knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. She wasn't free. In the distance, she could hear the faint sound of footsteps approaching. And she realized, with a sickening certainty, that she had become part of the house now, another soul trapped within its walls. And the house was always hungry for more. As the days passed, the town would talk of Marina's disappearance. But no one would ever find her. Not in the house. Not in the woods. Not anywhere. And the shadow in the attic? It waited patiently, as always, for the next visitor. S scanned the room. The attic was filled with old boxes, forgotten furniture, and layers of dust, but there was something else, something out of place. In the far corner of the room, there was a large, dark shape, standing perfectly still. The town carried on, unaware of the horrors that lingered within the crumbling house on the outskirts. But the whispers of its cursed past began to grow louder. Soon, the house became an unspoken legend, its walls hiding more than just dust and decay. They held the memories of those who had entered and never returned. Months passed. The house remained silent, as though waiting, its doors and windows darkened by years of neglect. The forest surrounding it had begun to creep closer, its tendrils of foliage growing wild, as if nature itself sought to protect the place from prying eyes. Yet, like all secrets, the house's story was never truly buried. One cold evening, as a fresh layer of snow blanketed the town, a new face arrived. It was Elena, a college student studying folklore and local history. She had come to the town with a singular purpose, to write her thesis on the strange occurrences surrounding the house. Over the past few weeks, Elena had pored over the town's old records, sifting through faded newspaper clippings and talking to anyone who would listen. Every story she uncovered seemed to point back to the same place, the same house, and the same chilling conclusion: something dark, something ancient, lingered there. Elena didn't believe in ghosts or curses, though. She was a scholar, a woman of reason. What intrigued her was not the supernatural, but the story itself, the way this house had haunted the town for generations. She thought she could unravel the mystery, offer a logical explanation, and put the legend to rest once and for all. It was the last week of December when she finally stood before the house, her breath visible in the frigid air. The snow crunched under her boots as she approached the front door, the house looming in front of her like a dark monolith. She had heard the rumors, read the reports, but now, standing here, she was determined to uncover the truth. The door creaked as she pushed it open, and immediately the coldness of the house seemed to swallow her. The familiar smell of mildew and rot filled the air. She hesitated, her heart beating faster than she expected. But the journalist in her pushed the fear aside. She had come for answers, and she would not leave without them. She stepped inside, the wooden floorboards groaning beneath her weight. The darkness enveloped her as she made her way through the long hallway. Her flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating the faded wallpaper and broken furniture. The house seemed frozen in time, as though it had been waiting for someone like her to arrive. As she ascended the staircase, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She pushed the thought aside and focused on her goal, the attic. Everything she had read pointed there, to that room, that place where the disappearances seemed to begin. The attic door stood at the end of the hall, cracked open just slightly, as though beckoning her. She reached for the handle, her fingers trembling. She had expected fear, but not this raw, primal terror that coursed through her as she stepped over the threshold. The attic was as dark as she remembered from the photographs, dusty, cluttered, abandoned. But as Elena's flashlight swept over the room, she froze. There, in the corner, was the same figure she had seen in the old photographs, the dark, tall shape, barely visible in the shadows. Elena felt her breath catch in her throat. She had hoped it was a myth, a trick of light or an exaggeration in the stories. But there it was, standing motionless in the corner of the attic, as though it had been waiting for her. For a moment, she wondered if she was seeing things, the stress of months of research, the cold of the house, perhaps it had all gotten to her. But then the figure shifted, its movement slow and deliberate, like a marionette. The flashlight flickered and dimmed, casting the attic into complete darkness. A whisper, low and almost inaudible, echoed through the room. "Leave." Elena's heart raced, panic rising in her chest. The voice wasn't just a whisper, it was a command, a warning. She took a step back, her mind screaming at her to run, but her feet were frozen to the spot. She reached for her phone, her hands trembling as she fumbled to turn on the flashlight again. The beam wavered, casting long, terrifying shadows along the walls. Suddenly, the figure moved closer. In the darkness, Elena could now make out the grotesque shape of its face, hollow eyes, a twisted mouth, and a smile that stretched impossibly wide. It was the same face that Mikhail had described in his report. The same face that had driven him mad. The whispering grew louder, becoming a chant, a low, guttural rhythm that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. "You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have come." Elena's breath came in short, panicked bursts as she backed toward the door. Her pulse pounded in her ears, and she felt the oppressive weight of the room closing in on her. The figure was still advancing, each step measured, slow, deliberate. Desperate, she turned and ran, bursting out of the attic, down the hallway, and into the main staircase. The house seemed to groan with life as the shadows chased after her, the whispers echoing in her ears. Her feet stumbled on the steps, and she nearly lost her balance as she reached the door. The cold air hit her face as she swung the door open, but it wasn't enough. she didn't get far. Before she could even take a step into the snow, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping her inside once more. The whispers stopped. The shadows receded. And then, silence. Elena pressed her hands against the door, her heart hammering in her chest. She felt the familiar feeling of the house closing in around her, of something ancient and malevolent waiting just beyond her reach. She tried the door again, pulling with all her strength, but it wouldn't budge. Her mind raced, trying to find a way out, but all of her thoughts felt muffled, distant, as if the house itself was suppressing her. A figure appeared in the hallway, emerging from the shadows, the same tall, dark shape. But now, there were more of them. Dozens, their faces obscured by the darkness, their eyes hollow and endless. They began to move toward her, slow and deliberate, like a tide of shadows. The last thing Elena saw before the darkness overtook her was the figure standing at the front of the group, smiling that grotesque, twisted smile. And then, there was nothing. The next day, the town was abuzz with news of Elena's disappearance. But there was no sign of her. No trace. It was as if she had vanished, swallowed by the house itself. And as the wind howled through the empty streets, the house stood silent, waiting once more, for the next soul to wander too close. The shadows in the attic remained, patient and hungry, as the legend continued to grow. The house would never let go. Not until it had claimed them all. The silence pressed in on Liam like a living thing, oppressive and all-consuming. The air felt stagnant, as though the house itself had not breathed in decades. As a photographer, he was used to capturing moments of eerie calm, but this felt different. This was not just stillness, it was an absence of life, an emptiness that gnawed at the edges of his mind. He took his first few steps inside, his camera slung over his shoulder. The floorboards groaned beneath his weight, each step echoing through the hall, as if the house itself were responding. Liam paused and glanced around, feeling an odd mixture of anticipation and unease. The legends of the house had been enough to draw him in, but now, standing in its decaying grandeur, he wondered if he had made a mistake. Still, he shook off the growing sense of discomfort. After all, this was what he did, explore the forgotten corners of the world, capture its secrets on film. He raised his camera and snapped a shot of the staircase, its railings cracked and splintered from years of neglect. The light from his flashlight bounced off the peeling wallpaper, casting distorted shadows across the walls. Liam made his way deeper into the house, moving cautiously through the hallway. He paused by the open door to the attic, the same door that had haunted the stories he had heard from the locals. The door was ajar, as if waiting for him. For a moment, Liam considered turning back. He had already captured plenty of photographs, and perhaps it was time to leave. But curiosity got the better of him. He stepped toward the attic. The temperature seemed to drop as he ascended the stairs, the chill seeping through his jacket and into his skin. The wooden steps creaked loudly underfoot, and he winced at the sound, half expecting something, or someone, to respond. But nothing happened. The house remained eerily still. At the top of the stairs, Liam hesitated. The door to the attic was slightly open, but there was a sense of unease about it, an unnatural stillness that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He had read about the disappearances, the strange figure that had been seen by others who had dared to enter this very room, but he refused to let himself become paranoid. This was just an old, abandoned house, after all. He pushed the door open. The attic was dim and cold. His flashlight revealed a cluttered space, filled with old furniture covered in sheets, wooden crates, and dusty belongings. A thick layer of dust coated everything, untouched by time. It was the kind of place where forgotten things went to die, where memories of the past were left to rot. And yet, there was something about the room that felt different, something unsettling in the air, something watching. He scanned the room with his flashlight, capturing the decay and abandonment in his lens. But then, his light flickered. A momentary glitch, he thought, just the batteries running low. But as he tried to adjust the flashlight, it flickered again, longer this time, and the shadows in the corners of the attic seemed to grow darker. Liam's pulse quickened. His breath caught when the air around him seemed to thicken. A sudden wave of cold swept through the room, much colder than the house had been moments ago. It felt like a presence, something unseen but palpably there, looming in the darkness. His light flickered once more and then went out completely. "Great," Liam muttered under his breath, fumbling for new batteries in his pocket. But as he did, something caught his eye. In the far corner of the attic, near the back wall, was a figure. Tall, thin, and draped in darkness. For a moment, he thought it was just a shadow, an illusion caused by the failing light. But as his eyes adjusted to the dimness, he realized that the figure was no illusion. It was a man, or at least, it looked like a man. The shape was too tall, too distorted, as though its limbs had been stretched unnaturally. Liam's heart pounded in his chest. His first instinct was to run, to flee this cursed place before it consumed him too. But something held him in place. His legs refused to move. The figure did not speak, did not move. It simply stood, watching. Then, it shifted. The sound was subtle at first, like a low, creaking whisper, but it grew louder. It was the sound of movement, slow, deliberate. The figure's head turned, slowly, until its eyes locked with Liam's. But they weren't eyes. At least, not in the way he understood eyes. They were dark, empty hollows, endless voids that seemed to suck in the light from the room, leaving only a chill behind. Liam's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to speak, to shout, to demand what this thing was, but no words came. His body felt paralyzed, caught in the thrall of whatever force held sway over this house. The figure began to move toward him, its long, disjointed limbs bending in unnatural angles, its movements jerky and uncoordinated. But despite its awkwardness, there was an unmistakable grace, a predatory quality to its every step. Liam stumbled backward, his hands searching frantically for the door. But before he could make it, the figure lunged. Time seemed to slow as Liam felt a cold, bone-chilling grip around his wrist. His heart thundered in his chest, but his legs felt like lead. He couldn't move. He couldn't escape. The figure leaned closer, its hollow eyes burning into his soul, and then it whispered, "You shouldn't have come." The voice was a rasping hiss, like the sound of rotting wood being scraped across metal. The grip around Liam's wrist tightened, and the air grew colder still. His breath formed visible clouds in the frigid atmosphere. He tried to scream, to fight back, but the cold was suffocating. His vision blurred, and his body felt heavy, weighed down by an unseen force. And then, everything went dark. The next morning, the town awoke to yet another strange disappearance. Liam, the photographer from the city, had vanished without a trace. His car was still parked near the edge of the woods, and his equipment was found abandoned on the front porch of the house. But there was no sign of him. The townspeople whispered once again. The house had claimed another. And in the attic, the shadow stood still, waiting for the next curious soul to wander too close, to trespass into its domain. The house was patient. Time meant nothing to it. It would wait. And when the next person came, the cycle would begin again. The shadow in the attic continued. The disappearance of Liam sent a ripple of unease through the town. No one spoke openly about the house anymore, but it lingered in the back of everyone's minds, a constant weight that they couldn't ignore. The older residents had seen this pattern before, people drawn to the house by its mystery, its tragic allure. And then, like clockwork, they vanished, swallowed by the shadows that clung to its crumbling walls. But it wasn't just the disappearances that haunted the town. There was something more. Something that had been quietly festering for generations. One cold, foggy morning, a letter arrived at the home of Thomas, a local historian who had spent most of his life avoiding the dark past of the house. The letter was old-fashioned, handwritten in neat, precise script, and it carried an unsettling sense of urgency. He opened it cautiously, his fingers trembling as he unfolded the parchment inside. It was from his grandfather. "Thomas," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I am long gone, and perhaps it is time for you to learn the truth. The house on the hill has never been simply abandoned. It is not just an old building, nor is it merely a place of dark rumors. The truth is far darker than you could ever imagine. My family has guarded the secret of that house for generations, and it is time for someone to break the curse. If you have the courage, come to the house. The attic is the key. You must go there. You must face the shadow." The letter ended abruptly, the ink smudged in places, as though the writer had been in a rush, or perhaps, under some sort of pressure. Thomas sat still for a long time, the letter in his hand, the weight of its contents sinking in. For years, he had told himself that the stories surrounding the house were nothing more than superstition and folklore. His grandfather had always been tight-lipped about the place, refusing to speak of it, even in the quiet of his final days. Thomas had grown up hearing hushed whispers of the house's curse, but had never believed them, until now. He knew what he had to do. The house seemed even more imposing as Thomas approached it. The fog hung low, casting the old structure in an eerie light. The windows were dark, like empty eyes staring into the unknown, and the wind carried a chill that seemed to seep deep into his bones. Thomas took a deep breath and stepped forward. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the front door. For a moment, he hesitated. The weight of his grandfather's letter was heavy on his mind, and the knowledge that he was about to face something ancient and terrible made his stomach churn. But there was no turning back. He had to know. He had to see the truth for himself. The door creaked open, just as it had for so many before him. It was almost as though the house was expecting him. Inside, the house seemed just as it always had, silent, decaying, and shrouded in darkness. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and dust, the same smell that had clung to it for decades. Thomas stepped carefully through the hall, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight. But this time, there was something different. The house felt alive, as if it were watching him, waiting. His footsteps echoed through the house as he made his way toward the stairs, the familiar dread of the place settling over him. But he pushed forward. The attic was calling to him, just as his grandfather had said. The staircase groaned as he ascended, each step feeling like it was leading him deeper into something far more sinister. The shadows seemed to stretch out, becoming darker with every step he took. At the top of the stairs, the attic door stood before him, slightly ajar. It felt like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to cross the threshold. Thomas reached for the door handle, his hand shaking. He could almost feel the presence on the other side, the weight of whatever lay in wait for him. But he had come this far. He had to face it. He pushed the door open. The attic was as he remembered from the stories, cluttered with old furniture, dusty boxes, and forgotten relics of the past. But there was something else. A presence, a feeling of being watched, that hung heavily in the air. The light from his lantern barely illuminated the far corners of the room, and the shadows seemed to twist unnaturally, as though they were alive. Thomas stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift and pulse, drawing his eyes to the farthest corner of the attic. There, standing motionless, was the same figure that had been described in every story. Tall, thin, and draped in shadow. Its form was elongated and distorted, its face hidden in the darkness. But Thomas could feel its eyes upon him, hollow, empty eyes that seemed to reach deep into his soul. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The house fell silent, and Thomas felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though the very air around him had turned suffocating. The figure took a slow step forward. "Leave," it whispered, the voice rasping and unnatural, like the sound of dry leaves in the wind. Thomas couldn't move. His body was paralyzed, caught in the grip of something far beyond his understanding. The figure took another step, its limbs stretching unnaturally as it came closer. But then, something inside him snapped. "No," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I won't leave." The figure stopped. For a moment, it seemed as though it was contemplating his defiance. Then, with a sudden movement, it lunged toward him. But Thomas was ready. He grabbed the nearest object, an old, rusted lantern, and swung it at the figure with all his strength. The lantern hit the figure, and an otherworldly scream tore through the house. The shadows recoiled, swirling around the room like a storm. The walls seemed to tremble, the house groaning under some unseen force. Thomas stumbled backward, his heart racing. The figure vanished, dissipating into the shadows as though it had never been there. But the house was not done with him. The temperature in the attic dropped dramatically, and the walls seemed to close in around him. The shadows twisted and turned, reaching for him with long, spindly fingers. In the corner of his vision, Thomas saw something move, something far darker, far more ancient, than the figure he had just faced. A presence, malevolent and hungry, lurked just beyond his reach. He knew he had to leave. He had to escape before it consumed him, just as it had consumed so many others. But the door to the attic slammed shut. The whispers began again, growing louder, more insistent. "You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have come." The shadows closed in, and Thomas realized the truth his grandfather had tried to warn him about. The house wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by something much worse, a presence, an ancient evil that had been waiting for centuries to be freed. And now, Thomas was its next victim. The next morning, the town awoke to a new wave of whispers. Thomas, the historian, had vanished without a trace, just as the others had. His office remained locked, his belongings left untouched, as if he had disappeared into thin air. The house, however, stood unchanged, waiting. Its secrets, its curse, remained buried within its decaying walls. And so, the cycle continued. The shadows in the attic would never be satisfied. They would always hunger for more. And the house would always wait.